Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. The ruins of Week 6 are still smoldering. Yet again, college football fans were taught a hard lesson that even a seemingly dull schedule can turn into anything but. There's been such chaos, we're going to take a radical re-examination of who should be on our island of playoff contenders. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You know, before we dive in, we'll just do a quick summary of the 12 teams we had going into this past weekend. Alabama, they lost to Vanderbilt in a game you may have heard of. Some of us heard about it. Texas had a very nice week to have a bye. Ohio State beat Iowa. Tennessee lost at Arkansas. Georgia beat Auburn. Penn State beat UCLA. Mizzou lost pretty hardly at Texas A&M. Miami survived Cal. Oh my goodness, did they survive Cal? And also Reese Davis's voice managed to survive that game. That was also kind of another thing. Iowa State managed to beat Baylor. Clemson went on the road and beat a hapless Florida State team. Oregon beat Michigan State on a Friday night game, and Boise State had no trouble with Utah State. There were a lot of other games there. I mean, just to also mention, I'm going to just say, 4 other undefeated teams that weren't in our list also lost. UNLV lost in overtime to Syracuse. Rutgers lost at Nebraska. Duke lost at Georgia Tech. And James Madison lost at ULM. I mean, this was a complete, I love the weeks like this. These are the weeks that make you, if you're a big college football fan, they're fun. I mean, we didn't even talk about some of the other close to ranked teams that lost, like Michigan on the road at Washington and USC on the road here in Minnesota. What are your thoughts, Shehan? How did this week hit you?
Well, listen, this is obviously one of the best college football weeks that we've had in a little while. And actually the stat was, 5 of the top 12 teams lost. That's the most that have lost in a single week since 2021. If we had gotten Miami, if that game had finished, it would have been the most teams in the top 12 to lose in 1 week since 2003. We didn't quite get it. It's okay. I think we still got a pretty good week of college football. The thing that's amazing about it, though, is that out of those top 12 teams that lost, outside of number 25 Texas A&M, which we can kind of nudge them in there because they were tied for 25, so I think we can basically count it. All of the rest were to unranked teams. So it's not just the fact that teams are losing, because number 2 lost last week. That's because they lost to number 4. That's not what's happening here. This is some of the best teams in college football. Number 1 Alabama, number 4 Tennessee, number 10 Michigan, losing to unranked teams. It's amazing. And I'll tell you what, too. I think that we have gotten so used to the idea of a Saban roster. And I think a Kirby Smart roster is probably like this too. But there's a level of excellence. I'll also probably throw Ohio State in there. Anyway, there's a level of excellence that especially the Saban teams got to where it was just normal teams can't even try to compete with this. There's just nothing. What are you supposed to do with 2012 Alabama if you're just a normal team? I think we might be at a point now, for various reasons, where that's starting to dissipate, where all of a sudden we're starting to have a team like Vanderbilt, which is Vanderbilt, the name in itself is very funny. The fact that they beat Alabama for the first time since 1984 and dropped 40 points for the first time since 1906. But Vanderbilt's not a bad team, right? They were probably going to be a bowl-ish team in the SEC. But that kind of team was not hanging with a mid-2010s Alabama. But maybe they can with the 2020s Alabama. And when that happens, I think that it opens up the sport in a whole lot of ways, because then it means, I don't know, when Ole Miss plays Kentucky maybe that's going to go badly for them. When Missouri plays Texas A&M, maybe that's going to go badly for them. When Tennessee plays Arkansas, maybe that's going to go badly for them. And it just like completely changes, I think, the calculus of the sport in so many ways, the fact that that happened. So I love it. And look, we have not had a week like this since we started doing this podcast. And because of that, we're going to do something unprecedented. This is the College Football Survivor Show. Guess what? Nobody survived. Everybody's off the island. Everybody, there was an emergency, and everybody's off. Everybody's off. So we are
starting. It has cleared the island. We shall populate it again.
Yes, it has cleared the island. So we are starting from scratch today. And not only are we going to evaluate teams to get back on the island, and don't worry, we won't take 5 hours to do this. Well, there's some that are no-brainers in there, and we also have kind of split teams into tiers. It's going to be a little bit of an easier way to think about things. But guess what? There was a lot of inertia to get teams into the preseason top 25, the preseason poll, the top 10. We talked about it in the preseason with Michigan at number 9. We talked about it in the preseason with Florida State at number 10. And when I look at the AP top 25 and coaches poll, there's a whole lot of inertia still left. We're getting that out of here. We are not following their lead. We are starting from scratch. And that means we're going to be talking about some teams that you might not expect, who deserve to be talked about at this point. Indiana, we're going to talk about you. Army, we are going to talk about you. And I'll tell you what, this is probably one of the more excited, the most excited I've been for a show in a little while.
Yes, absolutely. Me too. Well, before we start getting into them, let me just, again, put everyone on the same level of how we assemble our survivors. Now, we don't have to get too into the rules of week to week because we're starting from scratch, but we have a maximum of 12 teams, and we're probably going to go with 12. We vote the teams on. Typically, each week we have to vote one off, but we literally just voted everybody off, so we're going to start from scratch here. We have to include at least one member of each of the P4 conferences, and we have to include at least one G5 team. Now, beyond that, the way we can put this together can be any mix and match. I mean, we could have theoretically more than one G5 team. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's out there. And the way things are going, who knows? We may end up with 2. But certainly, there's some conferences that are looking stronger than others. So we may have a little bit of an imbalance here, but as each week goes on, I'm not sure which. There's only one conference I'm kind of like, I think we're only going to get one, and I hope we'll see if they even get a 4 seed from the P4. But that's how we do it. So, and I agree with how you're looking at it. There's teams that are going to be still at this point easy selections. Who do you think? Who are your like tier 1, S tier, however you want to phrase it? Who are the teams that you think still at this point, without question, have to be on our College Football Survivor Show island?
Well, I literally named it tier 1 because this is just like, okay, they haven't done anything wrong. I will say both these teams maybe haven't played anybody yet. I think we thought earlier in the year maybe one of these teams had played somebody. I think that ended up not maybe being the case. I got Texas and Ohio State. They've done everything that they needed to do. They've showed no weaknesses really at any point. They haven't really played with their food. Ohio State's game against Iowa, I think, showed us a little something, at least, about this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. One of the things that they showed me is that Chip Kelly needs to be a little less cute and just give the ball to his awesome running backs. But in the second half, they did a better job of doing that, pull away 35-7. Texas, of course, they've blown through their early schedule. They dominated Michigan, and while I don't know if Michigan's all that good, I think the way that they won, still pretty impressive. And I think also the traits that they showed in that game, specifically their ability to stop the run and their ability to create against Michigan's secondary. I think that those are things that will be good for them heading forward. So there are 2 teams at this point who I think are tier 1, no-brainers. They're back in the field in my mind. Do you agree, Texas and Ohio State?
I agree with those 2, but I'm leaning now again to also considering Oregon as part of that conversation, because as time has gone on, Boise State's a great team. I mean, we're going to certainly be talking about them again. Of the 3, they have the best win at this point, because I mean, we're watching Boise State from week to week, and they're looking awesome. And so I think perhaps a lot of it is that Idaho game. That was just a strange game for a lot of reasons. And back to back with the Boise State game, no one was sure what was going on. Is Boise State that great, or is I think people were more willing to say Oregon just looks like they're a little bit weak right now. And they also had a solid game against again at home with Michigan State. That game was kind of lesser watched because again it was a Friday night game, and kind of a little overshadowed by the overtime upset of UNLV. But I think they can. Of course, at the same time, we're going to get a very definitive answer very quick because this weekend is the game that we've been talking about since the offseason. It looked a little weird early on again because of that Idaho and Boise State game, but Ohio State going into Autzen, not an easy place to play. It's one of the loudest venues. It's one of the, for better or worse, it's one of the most hostile venues you can ever go into as an opposing fan. I say that personally, but also through a lot of anecdotes from a lot of other folks. They are not friendly in Autzen, and it is loud. So I'm very curious to see. We're going to get a real quick test to see if whoever wins that game, without a doubt, is going to be the shoe-in for the Big Ten, because the rest of the Big Ten, still not entirely sure about it. What do you think? Has Oregon done enough for you, or do you think they still need to prove themselves?
So they are in my second tier, and I'll tell you why. Yes, of course, they have the best win of this top group, but they have not just in that Boise State game, not just in that Idaho game, they've probably looked the clunkiest out of the top three teams. And some of that, frankly, has to do with the quarterback position. If you look actually at Dylan Gabriel's passing grades over the past couple of weeks, his last two games against UCLA and against Michigan State actually rank among the lowest passing grades that he's had since he's transferred to the power conference level between Oklahoma and Oregon. Some of this, I think, has to do with protection issues. I don't think all of it has to do with protection issues. I think they've cleaned that up a little bit since making some offensive line substitutions. But like UCLA, they had a great first half. And actually, that Oregon State win is probably the most complete game that they've played to this point. But the second half of UCLA, they kind of messed around a little bit. Michigan State, Dylan Gabriel throws 2 interceptions in that game, has one of his lower completion percentage games. The thing that Dylan Gabriel struggles with that Bo Nix didn't is just that short to mid game consistency. Like Bo Nix, the thing was you could set your watch to his 5 yards and in passing game. And yeah, most of his passes were less than 10 yards, but he also hit them at an unbelievable rate and let his guys make plays in traffic afterwards. Dylan Gabriel's more of a downfield passer, but he hasn't hit the downfield stuff at a high level to this point. So I think like Oregon's in. I want to be clear, Oregon's in, but I do think that they belong in this next group, which I literally just called, yeah, I guess. And so Oregon's in for sure. In that group also, I have Miami, who they're undefeated. They're undefeated. They've played a reasonably decent schedule. They're still undefeated. Also, they should not be undefeated. They should have 2 losses at this point, but they managed to find ways to pull games off. And what a coach will always tell you is you want to learn more about your team in a close win than you do after a loss, right? Like you want your team to learn a lesson without having to deal with the won in the loss column necessarily. But they are playing with fire. I will say though on the Miami front, maybe this is just like all of the reverse karma of Mario Cristobal blowing late games rolled into one, and they're just going to get a TCU-like run of getting every single break for an entire season. But I don't necessarily know that that's the case. I'll also mention the other team that I have, because I mentioned I have 3 teams in the second tier. It's Penn State. And Penn State is like they have been really good. They have a legitimate top 25 win over Illinois. They dominated West Virginia, who started to figure things out since that game. So like I think that they belong there. I believe they're in our CBS Sports 134 rankings, they're number 3. That's just a little much for me. I can't argue that much with it, right? Like, I mean, I think that what they've done, you can make a pretty good case that they're 3 or 4. I don't feel like their best is the same quality as Oregon or Miami or Texas or Ohio State, but like they haven't really done anything wrong to this point since some of the weirdness against Bowling Green. So I think that they certainly belong in our field. So I would vote all three of these in, but they're less sort of like no brainer, like definite national championship teams, and also I think all three over the next week or two we're going to learn a whole lot about.
Yeah, as you mentioned, because obviously Penn State had no trouble with UCLA, and UCLA is just a team that's rebuilding, struggling, however you want to put it. But that game on the road, and this has been a really, especially for the Big Ten, and I don't know how much stock I put into all of these comments that the traveling is too much for the teams. It's like, well, they're going to eventually, these kids, if they're super talented, they're going to be going to the NFL and traveling again. So I'm not
Well,
really.
you don't have to. I mean, one, you're not doing cross country all that often, and two, you're also like not having to like finish your physics homework when you're playing in the NFL too, right? Like, and actually,
all these physics majors.
well,
Yeah.
the other thing too, yeah, I'm sure, but the other thing too, fine, you have to finish your kinesiology homework. What does a knee do? But anyway, I think that I think that at the same time, like even in the NFL, you see when teams, for example, play back-to-back cross-country games, teams will stay in practice on the same in the same time
Yeah.
zone in a lot of cases. That's something that I think, especially if you are, one of these West Coast teams, for example, and you're having to go east a lot. Like I think that the Big Ten and ACC especially, they're gonna have to figure out some intermediaries because you can't
The
be
weird
having
thing
two
is the
suitors.
ACC has been almost the
Yeah,
exception because you have Miami
yeah,
and Stanford both crossing the country and just
that's
pulling
true.
upsets. Or I
Yeah.
wouldn't say, well, okay, sorry, Miami, that was not an upset, but still, I mean, that fourth quarter is when they came alive.
They defeated the woke agenda. They were big underdogs.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm curious though to see if Penn State, and again they got a little bit fortunate in that this is I believe this is an early kickoff for at least an earlier kickoff for them. So that'll be won't be as big of a body clock issue for the Nittany Lions. But that game at USC, and even though USC lost again to another physical team, I'm curious to see how they look. I'm not saying USC is necessarily going to fight its way back into an at-large bid, but this is going to be, I think, a real good test. Um, Again, they had no problem with their previous ranked opponent, which was Illinois. And Illinois, we might come back to them because you have to have a conversation about them when you actually look at their total resume. But I'm very curious. But I had, again, similar to you, I had Penn State, I had Miami. Although at this point, and it feels weird saying this, I still put Georgia in actually ahead of Miami because I can't I can't credibly think a Miami Georgia game is going to go in any other direction because Miami feels like that team. And I love the TCU thing you said because when you look at their schedule, they don't play Clemson. So maybe we'll get one of those situations where they play each other in the title game, lose like TCU did in the Big 12, and yet they'll still end up in the playoff because that'll be their only loss. And it's not a bad team to lose to at the rate Clemson has been going. But I put Georgia in there as well. How about you? And maybe I don't want to necessarily just do all undefeated teams because I mean there's a point where all right, Liberty, no, but is Georgia a team that you considered putting higher up, or did you put them further down?
Well, I'll tell you what. We have 12 undefeated teams. We could just say there's your 12 right there, and we don't even have to consider anybody else. No, so I have Georgia in a next tier on its own, and what that tier is because like they're Georgia, they have a win over Clemson, who's a team that I think very much could be in our field. I think that they belong, but this is sort of the like inertia thing that we talk about as well, where they crush Clemson in week one. Absolutely. Look amazing, just completely put them to bed. And since then haven't looked all that good. Cause they should have lost to Kentucky if Mark Stoops has the courage to go for it on 4th and 9. Then they lose to Alabama. And I still think Alabama's very good. We'll talk about them in a second, but doesn't look as good as it did a few days ago. And so, like, yes, this is Georgia. I still think that talent wise, they're in that elite tier. They still have a chance, I think, to be ahead above everybody else. But I don't think that they're untouchable at this point, right? Like, I think in the last 3 years, we're like, the teams that Georgia can lose to are the other top 5 talent teams. I think that Georgia could lose to Ole Miss. I think they could lose, some of these games along the way. And the other thing that you have to point out as well with Georgia is that they have a really hard schedule, like a really, really hard schedule. Of course, they lose this game to Alabama. They go to Texas. They go to Ole Miss. They play Tennessee at home, although maybe that's not as tough a game as it maybe looked like a few weeks ago. But, and maybe the Ole Miss game isn't either. But, like, that's 3 potential games that you could lose. And if you lose 2 of them, I mean, I don't know if this team at 9-3 is getting into the field. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they nearly lost to Kentucky. We keep forgetting that. I mean, that was a Kentucky team that clearly is competent. I'm not going to say they're necessarily going to run the table, but I mean, this kind of goes to something I've said before, and I know there's others that think like this, but it isn't necessarily the mainstream. I think among college football observers, I was like, I want to first wait to see before I start to assume the SEC is as strong as it typically is. Now the Big 12, I'll say, probably as chaotic and ugly as we expected. The ACC potentially a little stronger than we expected, only because the new teams suddenly all seem to have at least some level of life that are a little bit more, that spice it up, particularly SMU, we may get to in a little bit. But yeah, I agree though. Overall, I don't know if Georgia can make it through. But at this point, I think of the one-loss teams. They're the ones I'm still because they seem to just have a bad half and nearly came back and then went into their next game looking back to where they used to be. While Alabama had a great first half, nearly lost it, and then completely continued that downward dive into a stunner of a game. That I mean, you could have entire episodes just about that Vandy. By the way, I'd been to Vandy before. I did not realize it was 2.25 miles from the stadium to the river.
Yeah,
that is
it's
just
not close.
That makes that goal line, that marching that thing all the way over there, all the more stunning. I loved it. I watched the longer take of it, and I was absolutely intrigued watching all of this, especially as people have noted all the bachelorette parties that were disrupted by it. Gosh, bless college football for that. So we've got pretty much we are pretty much in unison here, though, just slightly different tiering with Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Georgia, Miami.
So I want to take this second now to my tier that I call give them some respect. And not all of them are going to make it, but I do think that all of them need to be considered. There are 4 teams that are undefeated left in the power conferences, and I think that all of them should be considered. So the one who returned from last week was Iowa State. They crushed Baylor, pulled away late in that game. I think that they certainly have done enough to remain in the field. The team that So actually, just to even take a step back. Okay, so obviously I do my CBS 134 ballot where we run through 1 through 134 every single team in college football. And after this past weekend, I'm like, I'm not looking at my old one. I'm completely blowing it up and starting from scratch. The team that when I thought about it and I looked at the metrics and I looked at their schedule and I looked at their wins, the team that I realized like, man, I probably just like, I don't know if I think it'll keep going forward, but like I have to take them more seriously now, is BYU. And BYU is number 1 in college football in strength of record, which is a metric that takes into account how an average team or how a team would do against your schedule and how your performance was related to that. So they have played as well against their schedule as anybody could have expected, is essentially what it comes down to. They have 2 ranked wins with Kansas State, who's a team that's top 15 in the country or top 20 in the country. They went on the road to SMU in a game that might be the underrated non-conference game of the year that nobody realized was a non-conference game of the year, but they win that game 18-15. They're what 5-0 right now. This was a team that I don't think many people, including myself, expected to make a bowl game, but now they're in first place in the Big 12. Them and Iowa State are the only undefeated teams remaining in the Big 12. We can decide in a second whether we want to put them into the field, but like this gets to a fundamental question, especially when we're putting together a contender list. How much is it for you about what a team has done and how much is it of what in your mind you project them to do? Because here's the reality. Whatever you want to project them to do, they have probably the most impressive resume in America to this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Kansas State win looks good because Kansas State bounced right back.
Yeah.
And when you look at the rest of their schedule, it isn't that awful. Because, I mean, most of the reason is, I mean, they got Arizona coming up. Oklahoma State just looks like they're unfortunately not going to be it this season for all the hopes the Cowboys fans had. UCF, not sure. At Utah, well, the Holy War is just the Holy War. Okay, that's going to be bonkers no matter what.
I might have to see if I
think
get
the
to that
latest
game.
update is Cam Rising is a mystery. I mean, all right, great. The complete the vortex of information that is the black hole of information that is Utah football. I don't even know what to make of it. Kansas, just probably the biggest disappointment in all of the P4. They arguably with Florida. Okay, maybe a little bit less disappointing than Florida State. Arizona State,
different disappointment.
They're a paper tiger. I mean, they've lost already, but when you look at their wins, they're awful wins. I mean, they're against teams that are not that great, or at least teams that have not been as good. And then Houston. So, I mean, BYU could easily just ride through the rest of this schedule, and they've got the hardest stuff behind them already. Again, because SMU ended up being better than expected. It's tough. I mean, Iowa State right now, I think, was coming in with just momentum, I would argue. I mean, because that was it. As you mentioned, I mean, you're a big proponent of him. Abu Sama's a great running back. We've seen Rocco Beck. We've seen that, how they were able to blow open the end of that game after kind of outlasting Houston. That was one where, again, we talked about last week. It was 3-0. And then suddenly the game went out and they were able to kind of break away using the talent they have. But if I were to pick between them right now,
well, you don't have to pick between them, though. You can put both in. Like, that's
no, I know,
the
but
thing.
The thing is, I was actually just thinking, like, I just realized they don't play the regular season. So
yeah, not until the Big 12 title game.
The BYU Iowa State title game we've all been waiting for. I remember years ago when they first announced they were having the Big 12 championship game in AT&T. It's still in AT&T, isn't it? I don't think they're moving it from there.
Yeah,
I remember I was the one who asked the commissioner, I'm like, what happens if it's like Iowa State and West Virginia? Like at the time, like what if you get teams that are nowhere near here? And my goodness, I'm not going to say it's going to happen. I don't want to jinx it, but
I'll tell you what, though. I'll tell you what. So Kansas State was in it a couple years ago, and they packed that thing. Like, Iowa State fans, and actually BYU fans are insane. BYU fans are I actually think the hilarious thing is that we could get BYU and Iowa State. It might actually set an attendance record for the Big 12 title game. Because one, because these fan bases travel so well, but two, they've like never been a part of anything like this before. This would be the best season for them. Iowa State certainly in program history. BYU, probably their best since the 80s, probably with the Lavelle Edwards days. So no, I think if we get Iowa State BYU, we might actually set an attendance record at the Big 12 title game.
Oh my gosh, it's exciting to think about. It is, but so are we? And we can let's keep moving forward some discussion here because I don't want to necessarily jump to picking like, are we going to have just one Big 12?
Yeah. And so again, the way that we do this, right? We can vote teams in. If we come to the end and we still have more teams on the board, we can kick a team right out. That's okay. We're allowed to do that. But I do want to mention the other two undefeated teams that there are in college football right now. So I think the power conference undefeated. Yeah. We'll get to the other undefeated G5s. Don't worry. But I think the weaker of the two resume wise is Pittsburgh, but their start has been it's been really impressive, man. They're 5-0 right now. I don't think that anybody expected that. They needed a crazy comeback against Cincinnati, which doesn't speak the most highly, but Cincinnati's also looked decent since that game, so maybe it's a good win, and it was on the road as well. They beat West Virginia, also in a really crazy end of game situation. They beat North Carolina this past week, also wins over Kent State and Youngstown State. I don't know that again, that this is a crazy good team. I think I'm gonna vote for them against being in our playoff field, but I mean, 5-0 is 5-0. They've got a great young quarterback right now in Eli Holstein, an Alabama transfer from Louisiana. He beat out the incumbent starter, Nate Yarnell, over the offseason, and he has been like other than Kenny Pickett, like I'm trying to think of the last time that Pitt has had a young promising quarterback this good. Like I'm not going to say that I know Pitt well enough to say that it's since Dan Marino. I'm sure that I'm forgetting somebody in the middle of this, but like he's not just a decent player. He's like an NFL prospect down the road. He's only a redshirt freshman right now, I believe. But I mean, like they have something here with him. I'm really excited to watch them continue. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I can quite put them in our playoff conversation as yet, but I mean, again, like they deserve mention, and I'd love to see them continue to play their way in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I find Pitt's story just intriguing because again, their fans have been just really down all the time.
Yeah.
And they lost, I
Yeah.
mean, they famously lost someone who said they wanted to go to a team that could win now
Yeah,
and went
yeah.
to
Deion Hayes, like they lost multiple defensive linemen that would have started on this team to Colorado, and like, and by the way, like Colorado, they're kind of figuring things out a little bit,
they
but
are.
like
We're gonna
Pitt,
probably talk. Yeah.
yeah, Pitt, we're not going to talk about them today, not today. But Pitt, like they have done the thing. They've come together, and actually, we talked about this before the show. If they can win their next two games, they play Cal and Syracuse, two tough games, but both at home. If they can win those two games, they could go to SMU on November 2nd, right to my backyard, and potentially play one of the biggest games of the weekend. That would be a lot of fun.
It would be, yeah. And we'll see how they handle an angry, vengeful Cal team that'll be stumbling into, I know they don't call it Heinz Field, but it's like a cringe. Oh, I don't know how to say it.
But I think that we do have to consider the fact, right? Like, so Cal, of course, the woke agenda, right? They have to know that making Pittsburgh and Allegheny County feel good about themselves is really key to their election efforts, right? So I think that they may like lay down and let Pitt have a really good win so that they're feeling up on themselves heading into early voting.
I love it. Well, there's one more team we got to talk about, though, of the undefeated P4s,
Yes.
and that's, of course, Indiana Hoosiers. What do because I agree, Pitt's schedule is neat, but it's just weak. It's absolutely weak.
Yeah.
Indiana's not quite there yet either, but they're a feel-good team. It is crazy that they've made it halfway through their regular season already. I mean, they are the first bowl eligible team in America, as we all expected. FIU, FCS at UCLA, which was that was a good game for them only because it established they went to the Rose Bowl, traveled across the country, played a night game, and had no trouble handling the Bruins, which again are a rebuilding team, however you want to put it. Charlotte, they did what they needed to do. Maryland, they were a team that they were able to put Maryland's kind of hopes of being anything more than another middle tier or low tier team in the Big Ten to rest. At Northwestern, started tricky, but they pulled away. They were able to look past the wackiness of that stadium. This Nebraska game after the bye, because they got a bye coming up, then they're going to be playing and hosting Nebraska. That'll be an interesting one to see. But at this point, I don't know. Do we think they're a feel good? I feel like they're a feel good right now, but it's just we've seen teams like this before. What do you make of them?
So I want to be clear about something. So I'm not voting them in right now, but they have not just played well against their schedule, they have been dominant against their schedule. Every single one of their 6 wins, including 3 Big Ten wins, have been by 2 touchdowns or more. And if you play a weak schedule, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to lay the wood against it. And they've done it to this point. All 3 Big Ten teams that they've played like could be bottom tier Big Ten teams, but they've treated them like bottom tier Big Ten teams. Something I do want to point out that I think is very relevant. They are in metrics like SP Plus and FPI by ESPN are a top 20 team. Right now in FPI, they're number 14. Which by the way, these sort of things take into account not just how you're playing, they take into account who you're doing it against, how you're playing against them. So like, yes, they've played an easy schedule to this point, and it might be as simple as when they play a good team, things will just happen. That's fine. But just for comparison, Indiana number 14 in FPI, LSU number 15, Oklahoma number 17, Iowa State number 19, right? Like Missouri,
I just
number
wonder, where's
22.
Miami in all of this? Because Miami is my idea of a team that should be crushing teams,
Yes.
but ends up in wildly competitive games at the end.
So in FPI, Miami's number 10. Actually, let me just run through for and so something to take into account this early in the season is that one, like, non-conference games kind of like if you crush a bad team, like, that can still help you a whole lot, whereas, in week 9 or 10 you'll have enough data to make it not as much. And two, like, there's still, I don't know with FPI specifically, but I know with SP plus, like, a lot of predictive metrics are still going to be involved with this. But all that said, the top 10 right now in FPI: Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss at 5, Tennessee, Notre Dame, Oregon, Penn State, Miami, and actually Clemson at 11. Just for just to let you know that. So I think that Indiana has been as impressive as anybody in college football this year. And you can contextualize that it's against a schedule that's not all that good, but they have played multiple games against power opponents and they've dominated those games. Actually, against power conference opponents, Indiana's winning games by an average of 20 points per game. So this is a team that I think, again, deserves legitimate mention. Curtis Rourke, one of the most underrated quarterbacks in college football. Defensively, they're playing really, really well. So they have a bye this week. Nebraska on October 19th, Washington October 26th. If they win those games and are heading into like November when they have Michigan and Ohio State, if they win those games, and especially if they win those games by more than 7 points, I think that they need to be in our fields. I do. Because, like, when you play well against lesser competition, you're still playing well. And that you still learn something about a team from those performances. I got actually got a TikTok of the comments that Kurt Signetti said at his, I think it was his opening press conference, where he was just like, "I win, Google me." Like, just it's one of the greatest quotes that I've ever heard in my life, because all this dude does is win. He's doing it right now at Indiana. I can't quite get all the way to voting them in, but, like, I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close.
They're definitely further along than Indiana. I 100% agree with you on that. I'm a little hesitant to put them in right now, but yeah, absolutely. Because then we just talk about BYU and you look at that resume and you're like, okay, but they actually did beat stuff. So I agree.
So
they are
Iowa State, BYU. Are you in or out on them?
Well, let's look at the rest before we decide either or both. That's where I'm at. Like, yeah, I think with Iowa State, I'm not sure if it's poll inertia pulling them forward, but at the same time, we knew the talent they had. You were very bullish on that, and it's so far done well. But at the same time, with Boise State, is it just that we didn't know the talent they had, or they didn't know? I mean, every team will say like they're looking forward to this season, but we talked to one of their guys when we were doing our Big 12 preview show, and he wasn't even sure where they were going to land. He wasn't bullish on them. So I guess at this point, the expectations are with Iowa State, and I'm not sure if this is just a product of how chaotic the Big 12 conference is turning out to be. But yeah, I think at this point, I'm going to give the Iowa State edge just a little bit, only because this is something we're expecting them to do, and we know they have the talent. But with BYU, this is closer to a TCU situation. Are they just going to suddenly get through, and then we're going to Cinderella is going to finally turn back into is the shoe's going to fall off in the middle of a playoff?
It's going to turn back into a pumpkin. I think that's what we're looking for. Turn back into
a pumpkin. Yeah. I'm not sure. Well, let's go ahead and take a quick break right now. When we get back, we're going to keep exploring this because there's so much to go over, because we haven't quite built out a 12-team list here. We've got to name a couple of other teams before we start voting on our newly revised 12-team list here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Okay, as we come back, we've talked about, again, some of these teams. We've talked a little bit about at least one one-loss team, and that's Georgia, who, Sean, you put on a tier of their own, and I kind of agree with that. But there's certainly some others we could mention. I mean, do we want to just lead off with a team that just lost, the former number one team, Alabama, or do we want to go with somebody else?
Well, this is actually a tier that I think we need to talk about sort of our philosophy towards it. And what I describe them as is, how do you solve a loss? And when you look at this group, all of them have a loss that's not only a loss, but like is a like, oh, ooh, what happened there? That shouldn't have happened. And I'm describing Alabama, who lost against Vanderbilt, Clemson, who got wiped off the freaking planet by Georgia and has looked really good since then, frankly. Tennessee, who lost this past week to Arkansas. Ole Miss, who dropped one to Kentucky. And another thing with Ole Miss is that they have nothing else on their resume at this point. Notre Dame, who of course has the loss to Northern Illinois, a team I actually didn't include on this list. I'm a no for them. Missouri, they just haven't been impressive outside of even that loss. Like they didn't look good against Boston College. They didn't look good against Vanderbilt. To me, they're not in consideration for being on this list. But those 5 teams are the one-loss teams that I look at and I'm like, I think that there's a real case. I think that when you look at their pedigree, when you look at their expectations, they all deserve to be on this list. But how do you just philosophically, let's take a step back first. How much do you think a bad loss should hurt a team versus the good stuff that they've done helping a team?
To me, I kind of it almost goes back to what I was saying with Alabama. I mean, it's one thing to beat Georgia and lose to Vandy, but the process in which that happened was really striking, especially when you look at the first half Alabama versus the second half Alabama, to losing the Vanderbilt and losing your cool at the end of the game, as people have seen, and kind of, I know Malachi Moore apologized for that, towards the end of that game. It just seems like they're listing right now, but they're still talented enough to beat anybody. So that's the frustration there. With a Clemson, I mean, yeah, they got blown out by Georgia at the beginning, but also it was kind of, is this a team that can kind of turn things around and then build from there? We've seen teams that have done that, plenty of them. Oregon had a similar vector after losing to Georgia one year. But here we see a Clemson team that looks stronger and stronger and is doing everything that was expected of them. There's teams out there that I'm actually really having trouble trying to figure out. I mean, LSU, they lost to USC, the opener. They've been doing what they're supposed to do since then. They had a couple close games there, but they've been looking fine. Kansas State lost to BYU. That doesn't look all that bad anymore. And they bounced right back from that. Similarly, you could say something about Illinois. I mean, you lose to Penn State. They're back in the rankings because it isn't a bad loss, to lose to Penn State on the road. I'm having real trouble sorting through some of these one-loss teams. About the only one I feel a lot of confidence about, and it was because what happened with me when I was creating my list, I had 8 teams plus a G5 because I wanted to just keep that separate. But I had one team that, the only team we haven't mentioned yet that was in my group was Clemson. I literally had Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Georgia, Miami, and Clemson as teams I was confident about, plus a Big 12. I'm not sure who to separate from this group. And I'm having my philosophy at this point is, who did you lose to? How did you lose to them? Was it a road loss? Was it a home loss? Like Syracuse, yeah, they've been looking okay, but Stanford shouldn't have been able to just walk into the dome and beat them. That to me was a weak loss. SMU's loss to BYU, we've talked about it. That looks stronger as time has gone on because BYU is the unexpected one. Nebraska, an overtime loss at home. Overtime, I always put a little bit of asterisk on to an Illinois team that has still remained ranked. Like that one, I'm wondering, is Nebraska going to come back there too? I know I'm not ranking them, but Colorado, losing a rivalry game to Nebraska and winning since then, they're not out of the picture entirely anymore. I thought they were. I was ready to write them off. And now I'm like, okay, they're kind of still in this conversation. Even Notre Dame. I mean, Texas A&M. I mean, where do we even put these teams? I mean, right now, Texas A&M looks more impressive than Notre Dame at this point because beating up Mizzou, we were kind of waiting for someone to do it, and it was Texas A&M. Have they been able to just bounce back from that Notre Dame loss? I'm not sure. Is that a stronger look right now than Notre Dame? Losing to NIU, but then looking great ever since. It's hard for me to pick someone in this group. And I think that's going to be one of the more tougher ones. I'm not even sure who the candidate group should be here.
Well, yeah, I think what's interesting, right, is like let's think about Alabama for just a second. I mean, they beat Wisconsin by 30 points. They beat Georgia, who's a team that we still have in our contender group. I mean, like, and outside, like, I think that what's interesting for me is when you have a resume that has a crazy negative data point. Well, when you take that data point away, how do you evaluate this team? Right? So, for example, I didn't put Missouri on our list at all because if you take away their bad data point, their resume isn't very good. I think for me, Ole Miss, right? Like they haven't done anything of note outside of their bad data point. Alabama has legitimate good data points across the board outside of their one extremely weird one. So I feel like for me, I mean, just to tell you, when I put together my college football 134 rankings, I still had them in my top 10. I actually still had them ahead of Georgia because I think that I can forgive a weird thing happening once. Now, if you have a weird thing happen once, then you go back and reevaluate, and you're like, I don't know. Like, actually, a team that really is really interesting to me in this discussion is Tennessee, because Tennessee loses to Arkansas, and all of a sudden you're looking back and you're like, wow, NC State really sucks. Like they're the biggest miss that I have had in college football this year. It may be the biggest miss of my entire career. Now I want to be clear. I picked them to finish second in the ACC. It's not like I didn't do anything crazy with them, but like still, right? Like I was pretty optimistic about them coming into the year, but their trenches are just gone. They lost Wake Forest this year. So a 51-10 win over NC State, maybe that doesn't mean anything. Oklahoma, they look terrible. And maybe that's not actually that quality of a win. I did not have Oklahoma in my own personal top 25. So, like, that's an example of a team where when they lose, you go back and reevaluate and you say maybe their data actually isn't that impressive. I don't feel that way about Alabama. I don't
I
feel
think
that
you
way.
can make that argument. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't feel that way, for example, about Clemson. If you take out their terrible data point, since then, they've been really good. And actually, I mean, the funny thing is, like, we, after that week one game, we were like, why didn't you play the young receivers? Why didn't you play Bryant Wesco? Why, like, did you not, like, prepare? Did you not, like, care about winning that game? Because, like, I'm not saying that Dabos, when he went into that game being like, well, we're screwed anyway, but like he kind of like when you watch them since that game, it kind of feels like that, doesn't it? Like they were just like, let's just take our loss and then we can start our real season. Because since that game, it's been pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, that's a vector you want to see. You want to see an early mistake and then kind of building from that. It's a little tougher when it's midseason, like what happened with Alabama. But at the same time, you look at that resume. Western Kentucky, not a great team, but they knocked off Toledo. That wrecked all the max chances in one game.
Yep.
South Florida has been a difficult team, for some. Wisconsin, as you pointed out, and of course that Georgia game. So I think maybe I would keep Alabama if I were to rank it towards the bottom, only because we're going to see they've got a couple of games coming up. Certainly, I mean, South Carolina, they're a mystery right now in a lot of ways. They have strong moments, they have weak moments, but that game at Tennessee, for both of those teams, that third Saturday in October is going to absolutely be a defining game for two programs, given what happened this past weekend. So I could see, just based on the talent, based on the strength, and also to be fair, Vanderbilt was nearly the team to knock off Mizzou. We knew it was coming. We kind of figured it was coming.
No, and again, like this is the name is Vanderbilt. The team on the front of the jersey is Vanderbilt, of course. But like I think we have to think about this like a just normal 7-win SEC team as well, right? And that's not good. You should not lose to that team if you're the number one team in the country. But like it's like if this team was exactly the same team in exactly the same situation, but you went on the road and that team was named South Carolina, like we wouldn't be making this many jokes about it, right? Like, it's different because it's Vanderbilt, because of what Vanderbilt means in this league and what Alabama means in this league. So I think for me, out of this kind of the how do you solve a loss group, I would vote in Alabama, Clemson, and Notre Dame. I think that outside of their weirdo losses that they should have not had, and they better not do again, or we're jettisoning them from the island forever. I think that those three teams are ones that I feel comfortable saying, well, the rest of their resume still gives them something to work with. Tennessee, I'm still waiting for a second good data point. Ole Miss, I'm still waiting for a second good data point.
The only one I'm still trying to figure out is Notre Dame. That is the only one of that group where I'm a little bit more with a pause, and I'm wondering how much of that is just the Notre Dame, razzle dazzle, however you want to put it.
Marcus
That
Freeman is generationally talented at blowing it in key situations, to be frank. But they have the win, and actually, I mean, let's quickly touch on another team. I kind of have. We're gonna do the group of five before we kind of get to this final group, but I basically have a group that's basically like a grab bag, just like I don't know, maybe let's think
yeah.
about it. One of the teams in that group after this past weekend, who by the way I think might have a pretty clear shot at the college football playoff. So it's Texas A&M Aggies. Texas A&M, after their win over Missouri this past week, I don't think that Missouri is a top 10 team, but I do think that Missouri is a top 30 team, and Texas A&M absolutely beat the brakes off of them. Well, all of a sudden, you look up, they crushed Florida on the road. They beat an Arkansas team that suddenly looks, I mean, that looks a little better than it did before. They beat a top 30 Missouri team, and their loss was a game that was technically 10 points to Notre Dame, but I think that game was was it even a tie game? I think heading into the 2-minute warning, essentially. So like,
Mhm.
it's not a bad loss whatsoever. And so I think what's interesting about it, though, is if you say that Texas A&M deserves to be in our field, which I think is a legitimate take. I'm on the fence about them. We'll get to them, but like, then how do you not have Notre Dame in there? Because they do have a head-to-head road win over them.
I keep forgetting that not only is Notre Dame playing Navy, but they're also playing Army this season.
They are.
So
They are.
there
We're
is
gonna
the
get to that.
potential for some real hilarity down the line here when we get those games back to back. Not back to back, but toward in about they start about like
Yes,
November
yes.
20, pardon me, October 26th, November 23rd. Ooh.
Yes.
And they're
It's gonna be
neutral
fun.
site games. They're
Are
neutral
they
site
both
games.
neutral site games?
Yeah, Navy's going to be at MetLife, and Yankee Stadium is going to be hosting the art. Oh my
What?
God! If Notre Dame has one loss and Army is undefeated, we're going to probably see. Can you imagine Yankee Stadium? Oh my goodness, that is going to be. Oh, whoa.
Well, I mean, gosh, I can't imagine like, if that happens, I mean, Notre Dame better win, because otherwise all these Notre Dame, Yankees, Los Angeles Lakers, New England Patriots fans are going to be absolutely devastated.
Especially now that Alabama lost. Now they got to find another
Especially
team.
now that Alabama lost.
My goodness. Yeah, no. So I'm just a little bit hesitant with Notre Dame, but I'm not sure
Okay.
who I would necessarily replace them
Okay,
with.
we can put them on the watch list with the two Big 12 teams.
Yeah. All right. So let's try and put this list together a little bit here. I mean, should we mention? I mean, we've talked about Army and Navy. They've both
Yes.
done well. I mean, it's a little Army's, I feel, rolling a little bit stronger than Navy. Navy had no problems with Air Force, which is just a complete basket case this season. But it wasn't like they blew them out. They had respect for their fellow service people. But I'm not sure about that. Liberty, I think, absolutely is just a joke. Liberty is just. I'm just gonna say this about Liberty. They're 4-0, 2-0 in Conference USA. They've had kind of some just bad luck. I mean, the App State game got canceled by no fault of their own. They've had a bye week. Depending on when this comes out, on Tuesday night, they're playing FIU. They're hosting FIU. Pitbull's favorite team could potentially just end this conversation. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I know a lot of people will be relieved if they just do. But that they're out there. We're not going to be on the list just yet. But Army and Navy, when I was trying to split them right now, I think if I was to give Boise State, I don't know how I would phrase it, like an adjutant, I would have it be Army.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because I think that to touch on Liberty for a second, look, they have to go undefeated to have a chance. I will say Sam Houston being kind of good is going to make things a little more interesting, but I don't think it'll make
regular
it that
season
much.
finale for those teams.
Yeah, I think it'll make it a little more interesting, but I don't know if it'll make it that much more interesting. Liberty was pretty dominant last year, and they have not been dominant to this point. 11-point win against East Carolina, 18 points against UTEP, 6 points against New Mexico State. I just don't think that they can go 13-0 again, but I think that that's going to end up being a big deal for them. And also the fact that they just don't have anything to hang their hat on with the schedule. So Navy's schedule has been a little better to this point, right? They beat Memphis, they went on the road and crushed UAB, they beat Air Force already. But I do think, like you mentioned, that Army just might be a better team at this point. They've been incredibly dominant, 24-7 against FAU, 37-14 against Rice, 49-7 against Tulsa this past week. I do think that Army is the top contender right now. It's going to get real interesting though, right? Because both these teams, like you mentioned, play against Notre Dame. Army has a couple more interesting games as well. That they have a road game against North Texas that'll get a little interesting. I want to be clear: neither of these teams can survive a loss and still be alive in the Group of Five conversation. They just don't, outside of Notre Dame, have the schedule for that. Navy goes to South Florida, so like I'm intrigued. Like I think this is real. I think that those two teams are the top contenders from the American Athletic Conference. So I will mention, not a team that's undefeated. They actually have 2 losses at this point, but Tulane might be awesome. Like Tulane nearly beat Kansas State, arguably should have beat Kansas State. Tulane nearly went on the road and beat Oklahoma. They've looked really good, 45-10 against South Florida, 71 by the way against UAB this past week. The issue for them is that they don't have other quality games at this point. They play Memphis at home, but Memphis hasn't been as good as we thought. They go on the road to Navy. It's going to be tough for them, I think, to get past the Mountain
Are they
West
a bit
Gym.
like SMU last year, where they had 2
Yes,
losses? If
very
they
much
got
so.
one of those, they'd be in the conversation. I think
Yes.
Tulane is just in that kind of awkward situation this season.
Yes. No, it's kind of like I think it's very much like that. And the issue, right, is last year there was a truly obvious team that was undefeated to have a chance to put it over them. If Boise State loses another game, it opens the door for Tulane, I think, if you're comparing 2 lost teams. I still think that Boise State might just be better, but that's a whole other conversation. And then UNLV, I think, similar situation. I think if UNLV is a 1-loss team, they're going to be higher priority than Tulane. But if Tulane does roll through and wins the American and maybe beats like a 9-3 Navy along the way and maybe an 11-win Army, like they're going to put themselves in the conversation. Obviously, we are not projecting that to this point. To me, the vote is still Boise State because their loss was so close to Oregon. If they got crushed by Oregon, I think we could be having an Army conversation right now. But I don't think that Boise State has ruined anything to this point. And I'm really excited. November 25th on CBS Sports Network. That's a Friday night game. Boise State plays UNLV. That is going to be appointment television.
It is, especially if UNLV can bounce back from that overtime loss. I think they absolutely will be, and I think they can. They absolutely can. Well, let's take a look at this. We should probably start putting together a list. We've been having a long conversation here.
Well, let's quickly run through I'm just going to name them, right? We don't have to talk about them too much. But this is kind of the list of like grab bag candidates. And maybe I'll drop a comment on each of them. So Texas A&M, I discussed a little bit. I think they have a very legitimate path to the playoff, but I also wouldn't mind just waiting, letting them kind of continue to win their way back in. LSU, absolutely not for me. I just do not think that they have the juice whatsoever. Then you kind of get to the Big 12 tier, Kansas State, Utah. I think one of them will rise up ultimately and be in this conversation, but they belong certainly behind the 2 Big 12 teams that we have. I think that both of them still have the ability to get back into the race. The issue for both of them is that since they each have a loss, they don't have a pathway to the at-large conversation, which both Iowa State and BYU do at this point. You mentioned Illinois. I mean, Illinois and Nebraska, they played a really close game. It's tough. I don't know necessarily that they can get into that group. SMU is interesting, especially if we think that BYU is legitimately a contender, because then their only loss was a 3-point loss against potentially the Big 12 champion. I think that they're right out there on the periphery as well. So again, it's an interesting group. UNLV we've talked about in previous weeks. Rutgers, unfortunately, I think is out of this conversation. But there's a lot of teams right now that I think have a very legitimate chance of making it into the field.
Yeah, my only nuance to that is I would say K-State and SMU are in the same boat. They both lost to a BYU team that apparently is better than was expected, But yeah, I think they need to prove themselves a little bit more to get them in, just because, again, I mean, SMU changed quarterbacks. I mean, there's a whole big complicated story to all of that. So let's take a look right now. At least between us, we've agreed: Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Miami, Georgia, Clemson. Are those teams we would agree to?
And I think we also included Alabama, and I think that we also included Boise State. So we are technically up
Yeah.
to 9 teams so far.
No, I like that. Okay. So then from there, let's talk about the conference that isn't included, and that's the Big 12. Who should we pick, or should we have two? We have Iowa State and we have BYU as teams that we would at least consider voting in.
My vote personally would be that I think that both should be in. Now, I want to be clear about which teams we're considering. Right, we have 3 spots left on the board. We only have 8 power conference teams and a group of 5 team at this point. We're considering Iowa State, BYU, Notre Dame, Indiana, Pittsburgh, of course, still in consideration. Tennessee, Ole Miss in consideration. We could put in a second group of 5 team, very much on the table. But I think that both of these Big 12 teams deserve to be in. Iowa State, like you mentioned, I think the team that we expected to maybe be in this conversation, especially after the win against Iowa. BYU, though, the best resume in America. I think that both of these teams are legitimate top 10 teams right now and deserve to be in our field.
Well, when you put it that way, I actually am completely sold. I have no idea who else I would eat, especially with that group. Yeah, okay, BYU, you're in. You're in. You're in. Hell, Notre Dame, you even got me on Notre Dame right now. Okay. I don't even know. When I'm comparing those other teams, I'm like, I don't even know who else would be.
Well, that's the thing, right? It's like, because if you look at just, again, if you look at our CBS 134 over at cbssports.com, the other teams that are in the top 12, Tennessee at number 11, Ole Miss at number 12, Texas A&M at number 15, and LSU at number 17, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know, really. Like, I don't think that any of those teams have a better case than BYU right now. Like, and again, people get, and actually, this is even another conversation, right? I put out my rankings. I put out my top 16. I actually specifically made it 16 and not 15 because I didn't want Texas A&M fans to yell at me, and I had them at 16. So I'm like, I might as well just include them. But I put out my top 16, and I had Indiana in it. I had BYU in it. And I had people be like, oh, well, would you really pick Indiana to beat Ole Miss or Oklahoma? And I'm like, dude, like, this is the thing. Like, I don't know, if we're setting odds on a neutral field, like, that's a conversation we can have. But like Oklahoma nearly lost to Houston. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. Like, I have in my mind this idea of how games might go, but like, this is the playoff. It's about the games you actually played on the football field. And when you talk about games that were actually played on a football field, BYU has the number 1 strength of record in America. So
yeah, I agree. BYU's schedule is what absolutely puts them in this list. Indiana's nice, and Indiana, as you said, is dominating in its wins. But right now, Indiana's dominating wins could make them an A-tier team in the Big Ten or a B-tier team in the Big Ten. That's what those teams tend to do against lesser competition. And we just haven't had any way to benchmark Indiana against a potential, another team that might be in that kind of mix. But BYU, again, when you look at the performance of the teams that they've beaten, and the teams that are now saying their only loss was to BYU, that SMU and Kansas State pair is absolutely looking better as each week goes on, and that's just a testament to BYU, and they seem to have taken that as like the fun team that is also kind of the unexpected riser in this group as part of the P4, which still feels new. It still feels new to even think of them as a P4 team. I know it's only been 2 seasons. All right, so it looks like we have our new island. Our new island is Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Georgia, Miami and Clemson from the ACC, Iowa State and BYU from the Big 12, Alabama's still there, Notre Dame, and Boise State. And we all know that, heaven knows, we're going to see one of these, at least a couple of these teams potentially lose this week. Can't wait to see what's next. Well, this has been going on for a while because we had to rebuild this from the ground up. I wanted to just take a second to thank all of you who are listening to us. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti, Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. Tell your friends. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and on X and TikTok at Shehan Jayaraja. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.